So let me now take this better number of 4.7 and stick it back into Treasury's model instead of 3.5. So going back to this analysis here, what happens if I stick in 4.7 instead of 3.5? I get, instead of a weighted average cost of capital in real terms of 6.2, I get 7.3. So I'm more than halfway to the 8 number just by doing that. So let's have a look at a second rationalisation for the 8% number. Everything in cost-benefit analysis is done with error. Cash flows, of course, are estimated probably with error. Weighted average cost of capital is estimated with error. Now, this has proved to be a significant issue with the Commerce Commission's regulatory work in the last 10, 12 years, and I've been involved in that process. And one of the things that everyone seems to agree on in those regulatory situations is that there is a striking asymmetry to errors when estimating the weighted average cost of capital. If you estimate the rate too high for regulatory purposes, well, that's great for producers, it's tough for consumers. If you estimate it too low, it might look as if it's good for consumers, but it won't be if the rate's so low that firms who are regulated just won't reinvest. They won't replace assets when they wear out. So because of that asymmetry, the Commission and other regulators have elected to choose estimates of the weighted average cost of capital that are above their point estimate to give protection because of that asymmetry in the errors. Now, the situation with public sector projects is of course not the same. It's not a regulatory situation, but there is, in my view, still a significant asymmetry in errors. If you overestimate the discount rate in the public sector, the result will be that you will knock out some potentially good projects, insofar as the discount rate in any way contributes to decisions about whether to go ahead or not. Whether it's political, well, that's not something I can deal with. But if the public sector elects not to undertake an investment project, that's a perfectly good one because the discount rate was overestimated. There will be some countervailing effects in the private sector. We know very well we have a huge health and education sector that has grown up alongside the public sector. It's supplying more and it's supplying higher quality. In addition, even apart from that point, if a public sector entity, let us say churning out widgets, is confronted by an investment project in which instead of paying you and I to sit there and hand make these widgets, someone's got a machine that will churn them out, and that's a very good investment project, NPV positive, but because they overestimated their discount rate, then they don't go ahead and do the project. There's a fair chance that a private sector entity will do it, if it's not already doing it, and sell the output to the public sector at a price which undercuts all that labour-intensive process stuff. And that goes on. Public sector does buy things from the private sector. So there are these countervailing private sector consequences of overestimating the discount rate in the public sector. But there's no symmetry. On the other side of it, if the public sector underestimates its discount rate and goes ahead and undertakes all these investment projects that make no sense at all, the private sector won't be reacting to that. So because of that asymmetry in the consequences of estimation errors in the discount rate, there is, as in regulation, an argument for cranking up your discount rate in order to compensate for that. Now, it's easy to say in principle. The tough part about this is how much would you crank it up? And a way of formalising this would be to say, let's choose a margin. How much do I add to the discount rate so that the probability of the chosen discount rate, which is my point estimate, whack hat, I add a margin so that the probability that that number exceeds the true but unknown value is equal to some probability. And that probability will, of course, be above 50%. So H is going to be above 50%. If further, I can reasonably say that my point estimate for whack hat, is normally distributed, then I can write it as the true but unknown value plus some standard deviation times the standard normal random variable z. When I do that, the true WACC value pops out of that equation, and I'm left with the statement there. The probability that a standard normal random variable is at least minus m over sigma equals h. So if I can specify what h is, for example, 84%, and I can estimate the standard deviation of WACC, and that's something I've done and worked for the Commission back in 2008, generated an estimate for the standard deviation of the distribution from which this random variable called the weighted average cost of capital estimate is drawn, about 1.5%. That would say to me that I should add about 1.5 percentage points to my WACC, and when I run it through Treasury's model, oops. So running it through Treasury's model, the same model back here, what I get here is that the weighted average cost of capital would go from 7.3 to 9.1. So I start off with what appears to be a highly unsatisfactory situation. It looks like even for an average risk project in the private sector, using the model that the Treasury is using, I can only get a real WACC of 6.2. I can crank that to 7.3 by recognising I'm interested in the long-term risk-free rate, not just what it is today, and I can crank it further to 9.1 by adding a not outrageous margin to WACC to provide some protection for the possibility, the certainty, in fact, that I will make some estimation error when it comes to WACC. Now, the moment I get to 9.1, I'm above 8. So then I say to myself, well, that gives me some room to bring down the risk measure, the asset beta for the projects I'm looking at in the public sector that will still preserve the 8. So the moment I've got a WACC figure above 8, namely 9.1, I can pull back the asset beta for the projects I'm looking at consistent with the number 8. And I can pull back that asset beta from 0.67 to 0.54. And if I were to crank up this probability measure H up a bit further to 90%, I could get it back even further. And by doing that, I get to a collection of asset beta numbers that no longer look like average risk numbers in the private sector. They look like lowish risk numbers. To give you some sort of comparison, what's about the lowest asset beta that you can find in a project in the private sector? Depending upon which period you look at, you can get any sort of asset beta. So you need to examine this issue fairly carefully. And the analysis that I've seen over the years, I don't think credibly you can find an asset beta in the private sector below about 0.3. That corresponds to rate of return regulated utilities that are subject to rate of return regulation in the United States. So a typical asset beta for the private sector is about 0.67. The lowest number you could conceivably find under very strict regulation would be 0.3. So if you are looking at asset betas of around 0.5, consistent with a public sector discount rate of 8 real, that is a collection of projects that are not of outrageously high risk and in fact are of risk levels significantly below that of the private sector. Now, in preparing slides, Bronwyn was very helpful and only gave me 5 of them. I never tested whether if I clicked I'd be able to produce an extra slide, so I took that as a very strong signal that I should stay with 5. But I thought, well, if I do have a bit of time left over, what else could I say? And what I'd like to just briefly mention, and obviously more than the 2 minutes that I have, unless I'm so deaf that Joey has in fact rung the bell about 10 minutes ago. There you go. I've now introduced certainty. I've got 2 minutes left. What can I do with the remaining 2 minutes? John does mention something called the coercive power of the state. And that can be interpreted in all kinds of ways, but I'll take a generous view of it. Every one of us in this room, I presume, are taxpayers, or have been, or will be at some point in the future. So effectively, we are each, in a broad sense of the word, part owners of public sector projects. It's a bit like saying you're a member of a superannuation scheme. Whether you like it or not, here's how your money's going to be invested. We don't have that with contributory defined contribution pension schemes. You have a choice about what portfolio you get. You know, you can choose high risk or low risk. But in the public sector, you've got no choice. If the public sector decides to do a Muldoon and give us all these think big projects, all the rest of us will get a share of it whether we like it or not. We can't trade out of it. Some of us would be happy with that. We love these high risk projects. Great, give me more, give me more. Those of us who hate it can't swap them with those of us who want the high risk projects. And in a nice paper done back in 1978 by Stapleton and Subramanian, they show that if people don't have the power to trade, which is what we're in if we are taxpayers, then discount rates ought to be cranked up in compensation for that. By how much? Very difficult to say. But the coercive power of the state does supplement the 2 points I'm mentioning here. So I think that one can get to 8% for a substantial fraction of public sector projects. Of course, there will be ones below that, just as there will be ones above it. But my view is that you can justify 8 as a default option, and therefore I think it's entirely sensible. And that represents my personal view, not simply my job to present an argument here. Great.
Thank you. I like your technique of sucking us in with a false sense of security and then hitting us with the real difficult stuff that hopefully persuades some of us at any rate that 8% is maybe not such a bad rate after all. However, we'll rely on Bronwyn to perhaps give us a neutral response to these two suggestions.
Well, when he hasn't said it today, but certainly when he introduced the commenters in the last couple of debates, he said that our role is to be a judge, as if we are a judge advising a jury. And certainly John Creedy, who I saw come in, took this very seriously when he commented and introduced with a very good slide of a judge. I'm going to interpret my role as judge slightly differently and take a few liberties with the two positions. And maybe insert some of my own interpretation. I mean, in fact, there's only one margin where I can say that one of these people is definitely wrong, even though that's not my job, but as Judge Dredd I will say it is, and that is that I believe, Martin, and you can't shoot alligators, they're protected. The main differences between the two positions are first, in the underlying model or framework that's chosen. Second, in the rate or level, which is ostensibly or is nominally the title of the debate. Thirdly, in the value of consistency, and there's a bit of Judge Dredd in here because neither of them really talked about it very much, but it's what I find most interesting in this. There's a different view about political economy, and of course there's quite a big difference in presentation style. Now, I'll ask for your indulgence because I thought that since I'm the last commentator of the last of this series of debates towards the end of the year, and it's Friday, I'll take a fairly light-hearted approach to it. So, what is the appropriate conceptual framework? We have two different views, and these are views that are general across the literature. One is whether one should use what is essentially the opportunity cost of capital, or whether one should use the slightly warmer, fuzzier social rate of time preference. So the basis of Martin's case is that it's the opportunity cost of capital, which of course assumes that when investing in projects, the government needs to take into account what it could have obtained had it invested elsewhere and got the same rate of return.